こんにちは。日本大好き外国人のマストゥラです。
天皇陛下万歳。
アメリカ人が昭和の日本の何を見て驚愕するの？そこには敗戦から立ち上がり世界を席巻した日本の姿があったんだよ。そして
大東亜戦争後の瓦礫の中から奇跡的な復興を遂げた日本は冷戦時代に米国との間で経済復興を図り産業重視の政策を推進した。
それではこの動画を一緒に見ていきましょう。どうぞ。
What happened to Japan? Japanese electronics used to be absolutely everywhere. We'd watch movies on Japanese DVD players and Japanese TVs. Products made in Japan were synonymous with high quality and affordability. And its biggest electronics companies, Sony, Sharp, Hitachi, Panasonic, Toshiba, they were household names around the world. So what happened?
The unconditional surrender of Japan.
I think people need to be keeping their eyes on Japan.
It's only this. She exactly.
Jobs have been lost.
Japan.
Following World War II, Japan was in ruins and on the verge of famine. The catalyst for its miraculous recovery was actually another war, the Cold War. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, battle lines were quickly being redrawn. The United States and Soviet Union, recently allies, became adversaries. In the middle of 1953, forces in the north of Korea invaded the south. For a while, it looked like they would successfully capture Seoul, the capital city. That was until the United States got involved. On one side stood North Korean forces and the Soviet Union. On the other, the South and the United States. It was the first proxy conflict of the new Cold War. Armies met on a battlefield that just a few years earlier had been a Japanese colonial possession. At first, the US Army shipped supplies all the way from the United States, but this was massively inefficient. So increasingly, it turned to the Japanese economy for munitions and other supplies. This demand stimulated Japan's economy, reintegrating it with world markets while also providing the basis for what would become a big strength in industrial manufacturing. Sensing this, Japan's Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda embarked on a policy of sustained economic development through heavy industrialization. To achieve this, he harnessed the recently established Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. MITI would become a key player in Japan's economic development. By coordinating Japan's banking sector and industrial manufacturers, it oversaw the emergence of major integrated conglomerate groups called keiretsu. It was influential enough to direct the keiretsu to focus on priority industries that were vital for industrialization, like coal mining, steel production, chemicals, and shipbuilding. But MITI also wanted the keiretsu to become strong in a new industry that was becoming economically and technologically significant: electronics. Despite the devastation of World War II, Japan's early transistor learning efforts were extensive. In 1952, on a trip to the United States, Masaru Ibaka, the founder of a small electronics company called Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, learned that AT&T was about to start licensing out the transistor to other companies, thereby making it available for use by other companies and researchers. Ibaka was able to persuade officials at MITI to pay the $55,000 licensing fee so that Sony could use the transistor in its own products. That interaction demonstrated a key feature of Japan's economic model. When they needed low-cost capital to fund investment, business leaders could go directly to the government. Ibaka returned to the United States in search of ideas from American transistor manufacturers. He decided that the best early application would be a transistor radio. In August of 1955, his company released its first radio, the TR-55. The TR-55 was actually the first product released under the company's new brand name, Sony. The TR-55 was important, but Sony knew it could improve the technology. That's why, before the end of 1957, it had already released the TR-63. The TR-63 had an important advantage over competitors like the Regency TR-1. It could fit into people's pockets. It soon became the first transistor radio to sell more than 1 million units. And it allowed Sony to establish itself in the world's biggest market, the United States. This was a huge moment for Japan, and a huge payoff for Sony. The company had bet everything on the transistor radio. If it failed, the company was doomed, but its success paved the way for other Japanese electronics companies. Encouraged by the sales of the TR-63, Sony's competitors Toshiba and Sharp decided to scale up their own production of transistor radios. By 1959, there were more than 6 million Japanese-made transistor radio sets in the United States. Sony, the first mover, grew from 7 employees to 500. This incredible success showed other Japanese firms and MITI that they should invest in transistor production. By 1960, Japanese transistor production reached parity with the United States. It was just one of the first triumphs of an epic decade. In 1960, Prime Minister Ikeda announced a plan to use tax breaks, infrastructure investment, and export incentives to double the size of the country's economy in 10 years. He did it in less than 7. The plan didn't just succeed. In the words of one historian, it enshrined economic growthism as a national secular religion. The Japanese model became a blueprint for rapid economic growth. It was being studied closely in South Korea, Taiwan, and China, and would provide inspiration for their own economic miracles. By the late 1960s, Japan's recovery was virtually complete. It had risen from the ashes of World War II to the first rank of economic powers. For its government and major companies, it was time to shift from recovery to dominance. Japan's economy wasn't just booming, it was maturing. Simple products like textiles and light manufacturing decreased in importance compared to more complex manufactured goods such as cars, ships, and electronics. Improved industrial capacity was also filtering down to consumers. Suddenly, every Japanese family needed its 3 treasures: a refrigerator, a washing machine, and a TV. The all-powerful MITI, which had spent years protecting Japanese firms by forcing foreign companies to license their technology to Japanese producers at discounted rates as a condition of doing business in Japan, they were looking for new opportunities. MITI set its sights on semiconductors. In 1971, they reorganized the Japanese computer industry from 6 separate companies into 3 paired groups. This evolved into direct coordination of R&D across the Japanese semiconductor industry, and before long, the VLSI project, Very Large-Scale Integrated Circuits. VLSI brought together 5 of Japan's leading semiconductor companies: NEC, Toshiba, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, and Fujitsu. Collectively, they were often known as the Sogo Denki, General Electric companies. At the time, these were some of the biggest companies in Japan, which meant they were increasingly influential overseas. Hitachi was one of the world's largest producers of analog computers. Toshiba controlled 63 subsidiaries and employed more than 100,000 people. Mitsubishi was a massive conglomerate that extracted natural gas in the Sultanate of Brunei and coal in Australia. And Fujitsu was on the leading edge of computer production in Japan. These were big companies, and normally they were major rivals, but they were brought together for a common cause: to overcome the lead held by foreign competitors, mainly US companies in high-tech production. VLSI borrowed from the same playbook that had already served Japan so well. Participants enjoyed easy access to capital, the benefits of government-sponsored research, access to engineering talent, and strategies for licensing technology from foreign suppliers. The project also assigned different parts of the microfabrication process to R&D staff at the participating companies. Interestingly, consumer electronics, like the ones that Sony produced, were excluded. This was all about industry. The VLSI project started in 1976. By the time it wrapped up in 1980, it generated more than 1,000 patents on all parts of the microfabrication process. It quickly became apparent that it had helped supercharge Japan's burgeoning semiconductor industry. By 1982, Japanese semiconductor companies were producing more dynamic random access memory chips, or DRAMs, than America was. And in 1983, they were still spending more money on new facilities. By the middle of the decade, Japan was spending more on R&D and making more semiconductor products in total than America. According to one report from the time, Japanese firms controlled 90% of world production of 256K DRAMs. It's almost impossible to believe. Just 40 years earlier, Japan's cities and economy were in ruins. Now, it was consuming more semiconductors than the United States, and putting them in cars, computers, and other high-tech products. Japan's economic model combines several key features: strong government influence, close collaboration between banks and manufacturers, an outstanding education system that produced highly skilled graduates, protection from overseas competitors, low wages, and a devalued currency that made its exports more attractive. But there's another important feature I haven't mentioned yet. John Gibbons was a physicist who spent 15 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and then served a long and distinguished career in government. He had this to say about another of Japan's key strengths. We gave free doctorates in nuclear science to their students and brought them to Oak Ridge. But you have to realize that the Japanese already had traditional skills and techniques. They are ahead of us in productivity in automobiles, in steel, in robotics. They recruit their managers from the factory floor. We get ours out of law schools. What John was talking about was closely related to Japan's leading education system, but it wasn't quite the same thing. There's an important word in Japanese, monozukuri. Its literal translation is production or making of things. It's the Japanese term for manufacturing, but it has a broader meaning that encompasses technological progress, know-how, and desire to innovate. Although the term monozukuri wasn't in use at the time, it helps to explain Japan's centuries of expertise in the production of fine crafts and ceramics. And it also helps explain why its manufacturers in diverse fields like shipbuilding, car making, and electronics achieved such incredible things so quickly. When we think of the legacies of Japanese manufacturing, it's easy to think of specific gadgets or cars. The Sony Walkman, or the TR-63 transistor radio, the PlayStation, the Toyota Corolla. But the greatest innovations weren't the products, they were the processes. You've heard of lean manufacturing, right? Or just-in-time production? Both were heavily based on the Toyota production system, a comprehensive management practice developed by its industrial engineers over 25 years following World War II. How about Kaizen, the practice of incremental continuous improvement? Interestingly, some of these concepts were introduced by American business teachers during the period of US occupation. In Japan's classrooms and factory floors, they found fertile ground. These were methods of scaling production with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. And they're part of why Japanese manufacturers, for a brief period of time, achieved the dominance they did. Japan's rise in semiconductors is part of the reason why it became the world's second largest economy. But instead of welcoming Japan's incredible rise as an amazing success story, lots of Americans were really angry. Their mood wasn't helped by aggressive language like this, from a Hitachi sales presentation to their Denver-based staff in 1985. Quote 10% below competition. If they requote, bid 10% under again. The bidding stops when Hitachi wins. Just 40 years previously, Hitachi was making weapons used in World War II. Now it almost sounded like it was encouraging its sales reps to engage in a different kind of war, a trade war. Many American complaints were well-founded. MITI subsidized Japanese semiconductor companies, which enabled them to sell at artificially low prices in foreign markets, a trade practice known as dumping. By 1985, America's trade deficit with Japan stood at about $50 billion. But the business community and political leaders didn't always express their anger in the right ways. One notorious incident occurred when a Toshiba subsidiary secretly sold the Soviet Union equipment that made its submarines quieter and therefore more dangerous to the US Navy. In response, 9 members of Congress assembled at the US Capitol and smashed a Toshiba boombox with sledgehammers. The footage was played over and over in Japan as an example of American intolerance. Japan bashing resonated with a wide swath of the American public in the 1980s, from car companies in Detroit to electronics manufacturers in Silicon Valley. American manufacturing was declining and Japan was the culprit, at least according to politicians eager to find someone to blame. Here's a typical quote from back then. We have to stop showing that white flag, to start running up the American flag, and to turn around, fight, and make America #1 again in international commerce so that American jobs are filled in this country. If we don't get cracking, get serious, and get leadership, our kids will be cheated by us. Who do you think said this? Donald Trump? No, it wasn't him, although he was saying this kind of stuff. It was Walter Mondale, the Democratic presidential nominee in 1984. It wasn't all anger. There was also some admiration of what Japan had accomplished. Popular books with titles like MITI and the Japanese Miracle and Trading Places argued that America needed to adapt its own industrial policy to keep up with Japan. In the latter, the author Clyde Prestowitz even wrote that the Japanese juggernaut cannot stop of its own volition, for Japan has created a kind of automatic wealth machine, perhaps the first since King Midas. A famous American sociologist, Ezra Vogel, published a book called Japan as #1, Lessons for America. However, even as these books were being published and the boomboxes were being smashed, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Let's quickly recap. Just 40 years on from the utter devastation of World War II, Japan had grown into the second largest economy in the world by pursuing a state-led industrialization policy that emphasized close links between manufacturers, suppliers, and the banking system, and protection in the form of tariffs and technology transfer requirements. Japanese firms grew strong at home and made inroads in international markets. In 1989, 32 of the world's top 50 companies by market capitalization were Japanese. But when you spend years pumping up your economy, you get bubbles. And what happens to bubbles? They burst. Much has been written about the causes of Japan's economic decline. The real answer is that structural long-term weaknesses were compounded by acute short-term factors. Let's begin with the bubble. Japan suffered the Indaka recession in the mid-1980s, which most economists today agree was caused by a rapid appreciation in the value of its currency, the yen. The appreciation of the yen undercut Japan's traditional advantage, exports and capital investment. This had been the cause of so much of its economic strength between the 1960s and the 1980s. The Japanese government responded by adopting an expansive fiscal policy. At the same time, the Bank of Japan, which had declared curbing the yen's appreciation a national priority, pursued aggressive monetary easing. Eventually, after repeated interest rate cuts, the yen began to drop in value. Mission accomplished, except not quite, because the Bank of Japan's policies hadn't just engineered a currency depreciation, they had also hugely inflated asset values. At the height of the market, all of the land in Japan, a country the size of California, was worth about $18 trillion, or almost 4 times the value of all property in the United States at the time. On December 29, 1989, Japan's stock market index peaked at 39,916 points, almost 5 times higher than at the start of the decade. It has never come close to that mark since. By August 1990, it had plummeted to half its value. Other assets also began to collapse. In desperation, the Bank of Japan lifted interest rates in an attempt to take air out of the bubble, but it was too late. Starved of capital and suddenly forced to repay loans with high interest rates, many Japanese companies collapsed. But an asset price crash is only half of the story of Japan's collapse. The other half of the story is about an inability to respond to change. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, other nations, especially Japan's East Asian neighbors, were gaining ground. Taiwan's semiconductor industry, led by TSMC, began to gain market share. In South Korea, new conglomerates such as Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and others were contributing to that country's own economic miracle. Helped along by lower labor costs and better targeted government support for business R&D and investment, South Korea caught up and largely surpassed Japan in semiconductors, all while China's economy was being led from the doldrums by Deng Xiaoping. They had studied Japan's industrial policies closely, and they were applying the lessons. Other countries were catching up and eating into Japan's market share, just as it had done in prior decades. Japan's government and central bank failed at key moments. So did its companies. They stopped innovating and they expanded into areas that were either a distraction, like insurance and movie studios, or not part of their core business, like nuclear power plants. They were arrogant and dismissive about competition from Korean and Chinese electronics companies. The biggest reason for the failure of Japanese companies, however, is the business model that allowed the Keiretsu to grow so large in the first place. Close collaboration with the government, a heavy focus on traditional industries, and a reluctance to admit foreign companies, people, and ideas. These strategies couldn't confront 2 major developments in the global economy, the decentralization of supply chains and softwares. It's interesting to compare Japan's continued strength in products characterized by internal production, like cars and cameras, to its weaknesses in those that have shifted to modular production, such as smartphones. There's really no better example than semiconductors. As we learned in my previous video about TSMC, its founder Morris Chang basically made one big bet. He was going to build a pure-play foundry, a company that did nothing but make chips. TSMC helped break apart what had been a highly centralized industry. Good news for them and the hundreds of startups that could outsource their manufacturing, but bad news for Japan. The second part of the transformation in manufacturing was the rise of software. You might think that Japan would excel in software. After all, they brought the world Kaizen, the practice of continuous incremental improvement. But Japan hasn't been able to operate on the leading edge of software development. Many economists actually point to Japan's weakness in software as the single biggest factor in the country's competitive decline relative to the United States. One study found that US firms that improved their performance over the 1990s made the biggest improvements in the areas where software was most critical. Think about so many of the electronics goods that we associate with the era of Japanese dominance. Personal entertainment devices like the Sony Walkman or the Nintendo Game Boy. Cameras made by companies like Nikon. Reliable, efficient cars like the Toyota Corolla. These are all great products that drew on Japan's superiority in craft manufacturing. But they were all fundamentally mechanical products. They relied on hardware, not software. So as software changed our tastes and created a new class of products, many of these mechanical goods and the companies that made them were left behind. Think about it. Do you own a standalone radio or digital camera today? Or do you just use your American or Chinese-made smartphone? What about your TV? Was it made in Japan or South Korea? Japan's economic collapse in the 1990s was so devastating and traumatic that the Japanese people refer to it as the lost decade. Although today, it's probably more accurate to say lost decades. What did it look like? Let's paint a picture. Japan's economic growth slowed, almost to half. Its market share in critical industries like semiconductors plummeted. And it meant that Japanese electronics companies, which had been ascendant until recently, started to become irrelevant. In 2005, when Apple built the iPod, Steve Jobs needed to be in Japan regularly because Japanese companies produced 70% of the parts. They were some of Apple's key suppliers. But just 5 years later, Apple had shifted their manufacturing strategy away from Japan and toward China. This led to the iPad using only 20% Japanese parts. Remember how I said earlier that in 1989, 32 of the world's top 50 companies by market cap were Japanese? Well, by 2018, there was just one, Toyota. The central preoccupation of Japanese politics since the lost decade has been to revive the dynamic culture of economic growth that was once a secular religion. But despite the best efforts of leaders like the late Abe Shinzo, who spent his second prime ministership trying to stimulate the economy, the sleeping giant wouldn't wait. Why? Because in addition to those huge changes I mentioned, there are other factors which weigh heavily against Japan. The first is demographics. Japan is really old. It sells more adult diapers than baby diapers. The baby boom generation born in the late 1940s and 50s is retiring, and there aren't enough young people to replace them. In 2014, Japan's population was 127 million. At current rates, that's expected to shift to 107 million by 2040 and 97 million by 2050. How can you be expected to be at the forefront of the ideas and technologies shaping the future if you're too old to take advantage of those opportunities? Japan's demographic challenge is closely related to another problem, the country's reluctance to admit new people and new ideas those people bring. The US isn't perfect, but it still boasts an unrivaled culture of dynamism and optimism, built largely on the contributions of skilled migrants who want to improve their lives and contribute to the next generation of innovations. The other is that, having now been in decline for as long as it was on the rise, Japan has a lot of ground to make up in order to catch countries like the United States and China. Guided by a visionary and vigorous government working in tandem with the industrial and banking sectors, there was a time when it looked like Japan and Japanese technology companies might rule the world. That era of dominance is over. Japan today faces massive challenges. Let's hope that, like it once did, it can overcome them and create another economic miracle. Thanks for watching.
さて、皆さんはどう感じましたか？私は人よりも訪日している外国人の声を聞いていると言ってもいいと思っているんだ。そしてどの国の人に聞いても特に成功者と呼ばれる経済を読み取れる。海外の人たちの声を多く聞いていると日本人のマインド、要するに日本人の人柄に魅了されているよ。それって日本には大きな未来があるということなんだよ。日本は必ず覚醒するよ。ありがとう。マストゥラ。最後までご視聴いただきありがとうございます。チャンネル登録をよろしくお願いします。いいねボタン、そしてコメントも大歓迎です。ぜひぜひコメントしてください。それでは次の動画でお会いしましょう。さようなら。